All right, so get this. Today we're going deep on education, specifically Australian education.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, you sent over a couple of research papers, and I got to say, at first I was like, what's the connection here? We've got one on swimming programs and another on ergonomics in schools.
Two very different topics, you'd think.
Totally. But then as I dug in, I realized they're both about giving kids real-world skills.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
Right. Stuff that impacts their health and well-being, things that, sometimes traditional academics kind of miss.
It's interesting how often those practical skills get pushed aside. It's all about grades and test scores. But what about the tools kids need to actually thrive outside of the classroom?
Exactly. Okay, so the first study, it takes us to Gippsland.
Gippsland, Victoria.
Yep, a rural area. And it has its fair share of challenges.
What kind of challenges?
Well, for one, they have lower rates of people going on to higher education.
Okay, I see.
And this study highlights another challenge, the lack of swimming and water safety education.
Oh, wow. Especially in Australia, a country surrounded by water, you'd think that'd be a top priority.
You'd think, right. But yeah, the study found that rural schools really struggle to offer those programs.
And that's where Monash University Gippsland steps in with a pretty creative solution, actually.
Oh, okay, I'm all ears.
They found a way to, kind of address two needs at once.
Okay, tell me more.
They created this pathway for their primary education students. So basically, they're training future teachers to become certified swimming instructors.
So they're getting qualified while they're studying. That's smart.
Exactly. And then these students, they go and provide free swimming lessons to local primary school kids.
Brilliant. So they're getting practical experience and serving the community at the same time. A win-win for everyone involved.
Absolutely. But I can only imagine the logistics of setting up a program like that.
Right. There must have been some hurdles along the way.
Oh, for sure. One of the first things they had to figure out was which organization to partner with for the instructor certifications. They were looking at ACTA, Swim Australia, and ACE Swim.
Were those two very different? What was the deciding factor?
Well, ACE Swim, they operate on this business model. Their instructors become franchisees, essentially.
So they charge for the lessons.
Right, with a percentage going back to the organization, which wouldn't really work with the university's aim of offering these lessons for free.
Ah, I see. That makes sense.
Plus, Monash University has this strong social justice focus. They wanted to ensure that the lessons were accessible to all kids, regardless of their family's income.
So ACTA was a better fit in the end.
Yeah, much better. Their values aligned more closely with the university's mission. But even with the right partner on board, there were still a lot of, bureaucratic hoops to jump through.
Ah, yes, bureaucracy. The bane of any good initiative, especially in education.
Tell me about it. The study actually mentions this almost funny situation. The lecturer who was spearheading the whole project. He was required to obtain a certificate in training and assessment.
Wait, really? Even though he was already a university lecturer?
Yep. Teaching at a higher level, it really highlights how sometimes these systems, they're more about checking boxes than, recognizing real-world expertise.
It's almost like they weren't even reading his CV. Just, oh, you need the certificate? Okay, go get it.
Exactly. It's pretty frustrating, to say the least.
Yeah, it points to a bit of a disconnect between, the academic world and the practical needs on the ground, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that disconnect was further amplified when they started working with local stakeholders. The leisure center, the swimming instructors who were already there.
Right, the people already embedded in the community.
Yeah, and then the primary schools themselves.
Mm,
Getting everyone on the same page, that was a challenge in itself.
I can imagine. So many moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone with their own way of doing things.
Precisely. Communication was a big one. Coordinating schedules with so many different parties involved. And then there were the differing levels of experience and, even just different approaches to teaching. The study mentions this interesting anecdote.
Oh, yeah, with the swimming supervisor.
Exactly. One of the student instructors was working with a child who was a bit hesitant to get in the water.
Oh, poor kid.
Yeah, and the student was using this gentle, encouraging approach. And then the swimming supervisor comes over and basically tells the student to just force the kid to participate.
Oh, wow. Really? That seems a bit harsh.
Yeah, it really highlights the clash of philosophies there. But to the students' credit, they stuck to their guns, continued with their more compassionate approach, and later on, the classroom teacher actually commended the student for handling the situation so well.
Good for them. That must have felt validating,
Yeah.
especially after being undermined like that.
Totally. It shows how these initiatives can challenge the status quo, shake things up a bit, and, This program, it kind of positioned the university and its students as outsiders in
Yeah.
a way.
Outsiders coming into a community with its established ways of doing things.
Exactly. So it wasn't just about teaching swimming, but also about navigating those existing power dynamics and those, kind of ingrained attitudes within the community.
That adds a whole other layer of complexity to it. It's not just about the skills themselves, but also about the social and emotional aspects of change.
It's a really important point. You're dealing with people's beliefs, experiences, even a sense of territoriality.
I hadn't thought about it that way. It's like you're not just introducing a program, you're introducing a whole new way of thinking.
Exactly. So, despite all these challenges, did they pull it off? Was the program a success?
Oh, yeah. The research highlights all this positive feedback they received from the students, the teachers, even the CEO of ASCTA.
That's amazing. So, it sounds like the impact went beyond just teaching kids how to swim.
Totally. One really interesting outcome was how it raised the profile of Monash University within the Gippsland region. Remember, we talked about how this area has historically low participation in higher education.
Right, right.
So by showcasing the practical skills and contributions of their students, the university kind of became an ambassador for higher education.
It's like they were saying, hey, look what you can achieve with a university education. Look at the impact you can have on your community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Planting those seeds of possibility, showing that university is a viable option. So it's not just about swimming skills, it's about raising aspirations and broadening horizons for a whole community. Really powerful stuff.
It really is.
Okay, before we move on to the second study about ergonomics, what would you say are the main takeaways from this deep dive into the swimming program?
Well, I think the biggest one is the importance of flexibility and collaboration in achieving educational goals. Nothing happens in a vacuum.
Right.
You have to be able to adapt to unexpected challenges and work effectively with all these different stakeholders.
It's a team effort for sure.
And secondly, I think it highlights the need for a deeper understanding of educational change. You can't just focus on the curriculum or the logistics. You have to consider the human element, the emotions, the power dynamics, all of that.
It's about people, ultimately.
It is. And lastly, I think it's a great reminder that the most innovative solutions often come from bridging those gaps between academia and the real world, recognizing that education is not just about textbook knowledge, but about equipping people with the skills they need to actually thrive in all aspects of life.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, now I'm really intrigued to see how these themes connect to the ergonomics study.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears and dive into the digital world.
Sounds good. Let's do it. All right, so the second study, it takes us to South Australia this time.
Okay, further down the coast.
Yeah, and they were looking at, well, specifically secondary schools there.
So high schoolers. Gotcha.
Yep, and their computer habits, or, well, I guess more broadly, the whole culture around computer use in those schools.
Interesting. So how did they gather this data? Were they observing students in computer labs, or did they interview them?
It was mainly through surveys. They targeted both regional and city schools.
So a good mix of different locations and demographics.
Exactly, trying to get a broad picture. And what they were interested in was, well, the teaching of healthy computing skills.
So not just about how to use the software, code, or anything like that.
Right. More about, how to use computers in a way that's good for your body. Ergonomics, essentially.
Oh, that makes sense. So what did they find? Are high schoolers in South Australia ergonomic pros?
Well, not quite, but the awareness was there. Over 90% of the schools knew about ergonomics.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So they know it's important. Problem solved, hey?
Well, if only it were that simple. Here's where things get a little tricky. Ready for this?
Get me.
A full 73% of those schools, despite knowing about ergonomics, they didn't actually have a written policy about it.
Wait, so they know it matters, but they haven't actually put anything formal in place to address it.
Yeah, it's kind of a head-scratcher. And it gets even more interesting. 66% of the schools said that, in their opinion, ergonomics wasn't given enough priority.
Hold on, so they acknowledge it's important, they're aware of it, but it's still not a priority.
Yep. And here's another layer. They also asked about whether ergonomics was actually taught in the curriculum. And, get this, 60% of the schools said they did include some content about it.
This is fascinating. They're teaching it, they know it's important, but it's not prioritized, and they don't have clear policies about it. That seems like a disconnect.
A big one. It's what's the message here for the students? Hey, this ergonomics thing, it's good to know about, but not really that important.
Yeah, mixed messages for sure. Okay, but hold on. The study also found that only about 27% of schools reported students actually complaining about computer-related aches and pains. Maybe it's not as big of a deal as we think.
That's a good point, and that low reporting rate makes you wonder,
Wonder what?
well, is it really reflecting the reality of what's going on?
You're saying maybe students are having problems but just not saying anything?
It's possible, right? Teenagers, they're not always the most in tune with their bodies, especially when it comes to things that might cause problems down the road.
True. It's easy to brush off those little twinges and aches when you're young.
And this study only looked at reported complaints. Who knows how many students might be experiencing discomfort but just not mentioning it?
Okay, so then what kind of problems could arise if we ignore ergonomics? We're talking long term, I mean.
We're talking things like, repetitive strain injuries, carpal tunnel syndrome, back pain, things that can really impact someone's life.
Wow, yeah, that's serious stuff. It's like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right?
Exactly. If we can help students develop good habits early on, it could save them a lot of trouble later.
And it's not just physical health either. If you're constantly in pain, it's going to impact your mental well-being too. Your ability to focus, to learn, to enjoy life.
Absolutely. And, it strikes me that there's a pretty strong parallel between this ergonomics study and that swimming program we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I see it. They're both about bridging that gap between knowing something is important and actually putting it into practice.
Right. In both cases, we have these skills that, on paper, everyone agrees are valuable, but for various reasons, they don't always get the attention or resources they deserve.
It's like with swimming. It's about ensuring kids have access to those basic water safety skills, no matter where they live or what their background is.
And with ergonomics, it's about preparing them for this world where technology is everywhere, giving them the tools to use it safely and effectively.
It's about looking beyond the traditional academic subjects and recognizing that these practical life skills are just as crucial, maybe even more so.
And it makes you think, are we doing enough to emphasize those kinds of skills? Are we really preparing young people for the world they're going to be living in?
It's a good question. And you know what? It's a question for our listeners too. Have you noticed this kind of disconnect in your own education or even in your workplace now?
I mean, think about it. Are there areas where what you were taught or what's emphasized doesn't quite match up with the reality of, well, just doing the thing?
Yeah, what stands out to you? What kind of gaps have you seen? Share your thoughts and experiences with us. You never know, your insights might spark some amazing solutions or inspire someone else to think differently about how we approach education. It's crazy to think how something as simple as like how you sit at your computer can have such a big impact on your health in the long run.
It's true, right? We often don't realize how these small, everyday habits can add up over time.
But why do you think these practical skills, swimming, ergonomics, all that, get overlooked so often in education? Is it a money thing or a time thing? Or do people just not see them as important as like, I don't know, calculus?
It's probably, a bit of everything. I mean, there's so much pressure on schools these days to, focus on standardized testing and academic performance.
Yeah, it's all about those test scores.
Right. And it's easy to see how something like teaching kids how to sit properly at a computer, it just doesn't seem as, well, urgent or as measurable as, teaching them algebra.
Yeah, it's harder to quantify those long-term benefits. And I think a lot of people probably assume it's just common sense. Like, I figured it out, so kids today can too, right?
That's a dangerous assumption, though. The thing is, technology has changed so much, even in the last decade. We're spending way more time in front of screens than we used to, which means those ergonomic risks are just much higher now.
So it's not just about individual responsibility anymore. It's about schools recognizing that the world has changed and equipping kids with the skills to, navigate that world safely.
Exactly. And as we've seen from both of these studies, neglecting those practical skills can lead to some pretty serious problems down the line.
Definitely. It's that whole ounce of prevention thing.
Exactly. Investing in prevention now can save a lot of trouble later on.
So what can we do as people who, care about education and well-being? What can we do to advocate for these kinds of changes? I mean, it can feel kind of overwhelming to try and tackle these big systemic issues.
It can, but it's important to remember that even small actions can make a difference. Like Just having these conversations, raising awareness among your friends and family, that's a great start.
Planting those seeds.
Yeah, just getting people thinking about these issues in a new way. And don't underestimate the power of your voice. Get involved with your local schools, go to those school board meetings, speak up in support of programs that prioritize these practical skills and preventive measures.
Yeah, sometimes it's easy to feel like you can't really make a difference, but you're right. We're not powerless in this.
We're not. And this conversation has got me thinking. If we're talking about the importance of ergonomics in a tech-driven world, maybe we should also be thinking about the ergonomics of, well, learning itself.
Whoa, that's an interesting idea. What do you mean by ergonomics of learning?
Well, I'm thinking, like, how can we design learning environments and experiences that are, optimized for well-being and how our brains actually work?
I like that. So like what, have a comfortable seating in classrooms.
Yeah. And things like incorporating movement and breaks into the school day, using natural light, even thinking about the timing of lessons to match up with, like, natural energy levels.
That's fascinating. It's like acknowledging that learning isn't just a mental activity, it's physical and emotional too.
Exactly. And it's about giving students the tools to understand their own needs and, how to learn best.
I love that. So as our listeners are reflecting on these studies and, all the things we've discussed, what's one question they should be asking themselves?
I think a good question is, how can you bring these principles of ergonomics, flexibility, real-world application, how can you bring those into your own life and your own learning journey?
Powerful stuff. It's amazing how we started with swimming lessons and computer ergonomics and ended up, rethinking how we approach learning as a whole.
That's the beauty of these deep dives. You never know where they'll lead.
That's so true. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Australian education.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for sending in those thought-provoking research papers. Keep those questions coming, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.